On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the U.S. trade deficit on an all-time high despite tariffs. Lessons learned? And China's needs for reform inside and out. How crucial is WTO reform? A government advisor weighs in.
Can a country or member of WTO be a kind of superpower out of the platform of principles? The answer is no.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program with the U.S. trade deficit, which surged to a record high in 2018 on the back of strong domestic demand fueled by lower taxes. That's despite the Trump administration's America First policies, including tariffs aimed at shrinking the trade gap. President Trump, who has dubbed himself as the tariff man, pledged on both the campaign trail and as president to cut the deficit by shutting out what he deemed as unfairly traded imports and renegotiating free trade agreements. Could the high trade deficit harm his popular support? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Things go contrary. President Trump has levied tariffs in an effort to bring down America's deficit with trading partners, but the gap grew bigger. Data released Wednesday showed the U.S. trade deficit reached $621 billion in 2018. That's up 12.5% from the previous year. Imports surged 7.5% to more than $3 trillion, while exports rose 6.3% to $2.5 trillion. Meanwhile, the data showed that China still runs the largest trade surplus with the U.S., followed by the European Union and Mexico. America's appetite for imports appears to have increased after the tariffs that Mr. Trump imposed last year. Businesses likely stocked up on imports in anticipation of more duties on Chinese goods, which ironically contributed to the deterioration of the trade deficit last year.
Well, the imbalance was there mainly because we import more than we export. The U.S. is much more of a services kind of economy, and so a lot of our imports are for products. Also, the imbalance was because companies said, you know, we want to get ahead of when these tariffs are likely to kick in, so let's buy up the imports that we need from overseas and have them on hand so that when the door does finally slam, we already have them at our disposal.
While exports of goods hit a record in 2018, they declined in the last 3 months of the year, weighed by the U.S.-China trade dispute, slowing global demand, and a strong dollar, which is making American-made goods less competitive on the international market.
So what's next for trade relations between China and U.S.? What does this mean? The ever-enlarging trade deficit. Let's ask our panelist in Washington, D.C., Jeff Moon, International Trade and Government Affairs Consultant and former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China. Joining us in Hong Kong, Hong Hao, Managing Director, Head of Research from Bocom International. In Beijing, last but not least, John Gong, Professor from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Moon. Is it of much concern that the deficit, rather the trade deficit, is getting ever bigger?
Well, there are several dimensions that we need to think about in response to that question. From a political perspective, this is a problem for the president. He has asserted that the trade deficit is the best measure of the effectiveness of any trade policy, and by that measure he has failed, so there are political consequences. From an economic perspective, it's less of a serious problem because there are so many other factors at play. The trade deficit is partly due to the tariffs, but also due to a big tax cut last year, diminishing overseas demand, and other factors that were discussed earlier. From a psychological perspective, there could be some sense among American voters that as a result of the increasing deficit, President Trump needs to be tougher in current negotiations with China on a trade agreement. And also, frankly, the biggest psychological difference that's been made by the tariffs has been that for the first time in 30 years, China has actually been willing to negotiate on industrial policy, which was something that was very difficult to do without tariffs as a part of the equation. So it's a complicated picture.
Okay, Mr. Hong, though, it's very interesting whether President Trump will still be able to make his logic across to the public, because despite of all the trade fights he picked up in his administration with the others, trading partners, China is not alone. Hong Kong, for example, with European countries, with Japan, South Korea, and many others. So the list goes on. The deficit is becoming ever bigger. So does it make the public in the U.S. think twice about exactly what has led to the deficit?
Yeah, I think some of the deficit last year was really seasonal. As you can see, the trade deficit really deteriorates in the last quarter of the year. And that is because the importers of the U.S. really trying to beat the tariff and trying to import as much as possible before the tariffs are imposed. So as a result, you see a huge deterioration of the trade deficit in the last quarter. So I would say that because people has stock up in the U.S. So I think going into the new year is the inventory that they built up last year would alleviate some of the trade deficits going into 2019. So I would say that because it's seasonal and also because the trade war or the trade negotiation is being resolved very soon. So I think into the second half of the year, the deficit could be normalized.
Professor Gong, the most apparent theory President Trump used in picking up trade disputes with the trading partners U.S. has now seem to apparently collapsed as a result of an ever-increasing trade deficit rather than lowering trade deficit. Will the public in the U.S., you think about this logic?
I'm not sure that President Trump and his people around him are convinced that his theory has collapsed. I think probably enforces their conviction that the real reason after all this stuff is because United States companies operating in China, like up to a third of the exports going to the United States because of corporate America operating in China. And this probably enforces their view that there has some kind of decoupling going on, that they want to bring these jobs back to the United States. So I think they probably see it that way. But I'm still very surprised and also very pleased to see that how deeply the two economies are intertwined with each other, how deeply corporate America's operation here in China is resilient and robust to these tariffs. I think it has a lot to do with, for example, last year the dollar is quite strong. RMB for a period of time was depreciating. That probably adds more fuel to the exports going to the other side of the Pacific. So all these reasons combined probably explain why we haven't seen the kind of trade deficit reduction that President Trump wants to see.
Well, it's not just the dollar vis-a-vis the RMB, it's also dollar vis-a-vis other currencies as well.
That's
and the
right.
trade deficit is not just trade deficit between the United States and China. It's
Right.
rather the U.S. trade deficit to all the other economies it is importing goods from. So, Mr. Moon, to you, I was reading quite widely before coming into the studio. Even Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, has been putting out huge amounts of articles on this online page trying to illustrate to the common Americans what trade deficit is about. Will this be the beginning of a learning process for the U.S. now about the logic behind the trade deficit, and therefore thinking twice about what kind of trade relations the country wants to achieve? I'm not just talking about U.S. and China, I'm also talking about U.S. and other trading partners as well.
Trade wars are a lose-lose proposition. Everyone loses as a result of it. And I've seen some of the reports that you're talking about on PBS, and there are people who are suffering as a result of the tariffs. I'm seeing fewer stories, but I'm still seeing them about people in China and in Europe that are also affected by this. So nobody wins. And to the extent that people are being affected, they are being educated, as you suggested. So I think that we need to come to a resolution of our economic differences so that we can end this distortion, frankly, in the markets between our various countries.
But the question really is, Mr. Moon, given the sophistication you have about the trade issues around the world, with your earlier position serving as the trade rep for China, obviously it's not just about how the U.S. think about it, but it's also about the global process of reaching consensus on trade and how to reform the mechanism. Will this help people to put a second thought about the reform of WTO and other trade mechanisms, whether it's multilateral or regional?
Well, I think it may, and it may cause some reluctance to engage in tariff wars in the future. But frankly, I think there's a consensus in the United States that the WTO mechanisms haven't been working properly because many countries have not been meeting their commitments. They've been saying that they'll do certain things and they won't. And so when that happens, extraordinary measures have to be taken. That's what we're looking at here. And that's why I fear that if we reach an agreement with China too early, a non-comprehensive agreement that doesn't address the real underlying issues like industrial policy differences, then this conflict will carry on. And instead of resolving the issues that are outstanding, we're going to have this kind of uncertainty into the long-term future.
Professor Gong.
I totally disagree. I think the American people are suffering from this. The farmers in the Midwest are suffering. They can't afford to wait any longer for the trade deal to be concluded. The downstream workers and businesses in the United States are suffering because of these high tariffs. And for that matter, people in China are also suffering. I think this doesn't make sense at all to drag on this for so long. We've been into this trade war for almost a year now, and it's time to wrap up. And there's a recession looming over there, and I think it's time for the United States and China to work together to conclude this totally unnecessary conflict between our two countries.
Mr. Hong, if one of the negotiation sides thinking about or assuming that it might have an upper hand, the longer it dragged on, the more one side might assume that it would possess or get from the other side. Will that really happen, given the fact that now we are seeing now some effects having on both sides of the negotiations?
Yeah, we're hoping for a satisfactory conclusion of the trade negotiation. But having said that, though, I think after a very drawn-out process, the two parties really come closer to the target, and also the original difference was so far apart, and now it seems to be getting closer. And so there's some remaining issues that has to be ironed out. For example, the currency issue and some other longer-term structural issue as well. But borrowing from historical evidence, the trade talks between U.S. and Japan lasted for almost 10 years. So we have seen a longer movie before, but we're just really hoping that this time around, we learn from history and get it resolved ASAP.
Mr. Moon, it is more than clear that there are divisions within the administration regarding the trade negotiations, whether with China or some of the others. For example, President Trump and the trade representative, Mr. Lighthizer, in public, even in front of the Chinese guests, were in a verbal spat against one another about where the direction of the negotiation should be and what should be the purpose eventually of the negotiation. So as a result of this, are we still going to see a very clear direction of the new U.S. negotiators? Or are we going to see, as things drag on, more vague statements, stances coming from the U.S., which would make the negotiation ever more difficult?
Well, I think you're right that there have been some differences between the U.S. negotiators. I mean, the difference between the President and Mr. Lighthizer was over whether we call an agreement a memorandum of understanding. It wasn't a fundamental policy difference. I think they're on basically the same page. And I agree with the previous guests that the differences with China seem to be narrowing and getting more focused. There's a 100-page document out there that's apparently being negotiated. 30 pages of that would deal with IPR issues, which is also very positive. So those are positive signs. President Trump has said he wants to get to an agreement President Xi has said the same thing. So there's a lot of positive talk, but I'm wondering if behind that smoke there's real fire to get to the real crux of the issues and get these things resolved once and for all, because as Professor Gong said, there is pain out there, and resolving these issues would be very helpful to everybody.
Whether inside the United States there are efforts being made in order to contribute to the success of this negotiation besides the negotiation itself, I'm not very clear. However, Professor Gong, as you may know, the ongoing National People's Congress will study the draft once and again tomorrow, on Friday, for foreign investment law. That is one law likely to replace the older version, which was used since 1979, the very beginning of China's reform and opening up, providing more opportunity for foreign investors. It was supposed to serve as a basic law, Professor Gong. So will these kinds of legislation process going on in China also feed the momentum at the negotiation table?
Well, I mean, we put these words explicitly in this piece of legislation, testifies to the extent of sincerity on our part, I think, when it comes to enforcement. And I concur that, and I can see that in the past there might be a room for improvement from China's perspective in terms of enforcement and follow-up on things we promised to the United States. But this time, I think it's totally different. I hope, Mr. Lighthizer's office would see through this that we are actually putting these words explicitly in this piece of legislation. We say there's going to be no forced technology transfer. We say there's going to be, subsidies going to be in line with the law, and all these things are directly coming from his report, right? So, this, and I don't understand. I don't know in the world what other things can be more serious in terms of enforcement than putting things into a piece of legislation and legalize it, right?
There is only one thing that we haven't talked about, which is the key to this, is the trade negotiation about the trade negotiation. Or is the trade negotiation in some eyes is about something much more than the trade negotiation, seeking for much more results than what the trade negotiation could achieve. That is totally a different thing, Mr. Hong.
That's right. I think, at the beginning of the trade negotiation or the trade dispute, really the U.S. was aiming for much more than the trade deficit. And, as we discussed before, some of the trade deficit is really structural. Basically the reason being Chinese people save too hard and the U.S. people spend too much. And so I think the trade deficit, especially between U.S. and China, is a structural image of the savings habits between two countries. But I think, as the Chinese consumer grows richer, and spend more, I think, structurally it would resolve the deficit problem automatically in the long run. So I would say that, trying to get to the sort of a longer-term structural issue right now, through a very short trade talks, is probably unproductive.
Mr. Moon, on the other hand, well, the trading partners are trying to restructuring their own economies, China included. What about the United States? I mean, always restructuring within one's own system is the most difficult thing for any country. China is true, for the U.S. is true as well. So how will wealth be better distributed fairly, or more fairly than it used to be, and therefore less conflict within the country among different groups, social groups? That probably is something that the U.S. wants to look at. Do you see momentum of that already rising, or are we still far away from that?
This issue will be addressed through the American political process. There won't be a central plan that will force redistribution of wealth. We are already into our presidential political season, and there are various candidates that are already talking about redistribution of wealth as a possible goal. So we need to see what kind of plans they outline, and we need to see whether our legislature is ready to adopt any of those measures, and that will be the process. If we feel that we need to redistribute wealth, that will be the process that we'll do it through.
Now, gentlemen, we only have 1.5 minutes left. Why don't we have 20 seconds for every one of you? Help us to understand. Any inspiration will the story that we just analyzed would help us to understand better about the nature of trade, particularly the nature of trade between China and the United States. Mr. Moon, would you like to go first?
Yes, I think the most important thing to think about is the comprehensiveness of any trade agreement that the U.S. and China sign. I hope that they will resolve as many issues as possible at the executive level, because if they don't, then we will get into a cycle of reciprocity and disputes to deal with issues that we haven't been able to get to. And that would be unfortunate.
Mr. Hong?
Yeah, I think the trade disputes is going to be resolved very soon, and I think with the structural reforms that the Chinese government is pushing on, I think the longer-term structural issue will be resolved automatically as well.
I see. Professor Gong.
Well, I think trade is a very complicated thing. In general, trade is always a good thing. But I think I'm totally opposed to the idea that we describe trade in the context of political terms, And I hope that President Trump understands what trade really means. And definitely, a trade deficit is not lost.
Well, it takes a president to understand. It also takes the constituencies to understand the nature of trade as well in order to make the right decisions. Thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for helping us to understand better the nature of the story. Jeff Moon, Hong Hao, Zhang Gong. Appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China's need for reform inside and out. How crucial is WTO reform? A government advisor weighs in right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The annual session of the National People's Congress is now taking place in Beijing. China, as the second largest economy in the world and the largest developing country, not only needs to focus on its own structural reform, but take part in crucial debates about WTO reform, or the reform of the World Trade Organization. That is argued by Zhou Hanmin, a member of the Standing Committee of China's advisory body. He told me that there are principles China should stick up to in the debate. And Zhou researched for policymakers about the WTO before China made the final decision to join the trade body. What role should China play in the reform of WTO? What exactly will be in China's proposal? Take a look. Mr. Zhou, welcome to CGTN. You've been advising through the platform of CPPCC about role that China should play in the reform of WTO. Exactly what you meant.
As a matter of fact, just after reading two proposals by those major players of WTO, I mean the United States, Japan, and EU, late last year and early this year, I think on the agenda of WTO, a very major issue is WTO reform. China is a key player in trade and economic development in the world because China is #1 for its trading amount. So that's why we need to have our proposal. Of course, our proposal is not going exactly in the opposite way of their proposal, but to see what kinds of momentum, what kinds of consensus we can reach.
When you say China should have its own version of proposals, what should be some of the most important elements in this proposal?
We need to go back to the history. We need to trace back to the history of the formation of WTO and its predecessor, GATT, G-A-T-T. G-A-T-T was formed on the very first day of 1948 after the Second World War. What we are going to trace back is just try to stick to those principles. Those principles have successfully experienced the ups and downs of the international economic development.
What are those principles you're
For
talking
instance,
about?
most favored nation principle. That's very much important. National treatment is, of course. Non-discrimination is the third. And then last but not least, differentiated treatments towards developed and developing nations or members. Those rules and laws we need to follow.
But as you may know, Mr. Zhou, there is a debate about exactly what kind of country is China. Is it a developing country? China claims itself to be the biggest developing country in the world. However, China has already become the second largest economy in the world, and therefore, how to categorize China, especially, for example, in the upcoming WTO reform, will be a hot debate issue, isn't it?
Of course, it is. However, there is a very important standard to clarify which country in which category. That is GDP per capita. If you say the overall amount of China is, of course, China is the second largest one so far as the overall amount is concerned. If you judge GDP per capita, it's almost maybe number 70 along the list of all those 193 members. So China is still in the stage as a developing nation. However, in certain areas, especially along the coastal areas, some cities and provinces could be in the category of so-called developed regions. However, judging a sovereign state, you need to take the overall picture. Overall picture is China is still in that category. This is my view.
Just a few days ago, the United States have put forward a document to the WTO suggesting its trade policy is not going to be dictated by Geneva, but rather decided in Washington. In other words, it's suggesting to the WTO that this is a make it or break it deal with the United States during the reform of the WTO. So, Mr. Zhou, when you have the largest economies acting like that, the fate of WTO is very unpredictable. Therefore, what should be China's role?
Actually, in your question, three elements could be clarified in a very, I will say, orderly way. First, can a country or member of WTO be a kind of superpower out of the platform of principles? The answer is no. Second, who is the founder or who is among the founders of the principles themselves? And that founder should be abiding by the rules and laws of the WTO. United States is, of course, the first one to be mentioned. And thirdly, of course, today we have noticed, we have sensed, and we have experienced a new trend. Unilateralism just tried to go against the multilateralism. This is something very much dangerous. I will say people should go back to the principles themselves, even though the principles are not 100% right in face of the new change of the world economy. However, change is one thing. Try to abolish it is the other way.
Right.
Frankly speaking, who is the first and foremost beneficiary of the rule itself? The United States is, of course.
Some of the most developed economies in the world, they do not see that they've been benefiting from the international institutions over the past 10 years, let's just put it that way. They think the others, for example, China and some of the other emerging economies are the biggest winners rather than theirs, and therefore they might make a choice to walk away. That's a phrase that President Trump has been using quite frequently recently. Can the rest of the WTO be able to risk the possibility that the U.S., the largest economy, walk away?
People not outside of the U.S., I would say those rational people in the Congress, in the cabinet themselves, they do think a country, a strong country, used to play a key role for the security and peaceful development of the world. Now they try to abolish, to jeopardize the rules themselves. This is a very dangerous trend. So today, we need to have not a coalition. We need to have a common sense. We need to have a consensus. First and foremost, common sense plays a mirror to indicate the future. What is a mirror? Right after the ending of the Second World War, WTO rules and laws are one of those common senses. We need to follow. Never mean we are not going to change even a little bit. Even we can change dramatically or put it upside down sometimes. However, you need to use the due process. Due process sometimes precedes the rights. This is an Anglo-American legal doctrine or legal principle. Procedural is so important.
Right. Mr. Zhou, in that spirit, you've seen recently there is ruling coming from the WTO about the dispute between China and the United States, whether China has been putting too much subsidies towards some of the agricultural products. And the ruling by the WTO now is in favor of the United States. So when you're talking about rules, which means there could be possibilities that China may not necessarily going to benefit from every ruling of the WTO, even on some of the very critical issues. Is China ready for that?
China has been ready for that. Not is China going to be ready for that. For instance, right after China joined the WTO on the very moment of December the 11th, 2001, up to today, several dozens of cases have been brought up involving China. And large percentage of those, the rulings were against China. China still try to abide by because it's rules. So for us, it is to see reform never ends.
Right.
We take reform and open the policy as the second revolution of China. We are still in the middle way. Towards the future, we need to not to tolerate, but to sense and experience those rulings against us. And then, frankly speaking to me, it's a kind of force to push us, have the internal reform to meet the new needs and wants of the society.
Right. China has filed complaints inside the WTO about the tariff raise against the Chinese products as a result of the ongoing, what some say, trade war. However, there's no result yet coming from the WTO ruling, so which means on even critical issues, China, together with the others, have to be very patient waiting for a ruling from the WTO, which already could be much later than what the realities would expect. So is China ready for that as well?
You are mentioning a very critical point. Why it's so slow, not so effective, why we need to have WTO reform. DSP is a very, I would say, important example for us to follow. Dispute settlement body. They have two layers. But now, just because the principle to reach agreement in WTO is what we call mutual consensus. Meaning, even one member is trying very hard to do something against the ruling, then nothing could happen. The appellate body of DSP now only have 3 judges. They have no time to take all the complaints. And now you could see, by the end of this year, 1 or 2 will retire again. That means DSP itself is almost nothing, just with a framework there.
Paralyzed.
Who to be, you're right, paralyzed. Who to be blamed? The answer is very simple, the United States. Why? They say quite a lot of rulings are against the U.S. They are not satisfied with the ruling themselves.
Are we going to expect to see these kind of things repeat itself over and over again? That one of the largest economies that's never going to come back to the principles and the others just have to suck it?
We cannot say the U.S. are not going to be back to the principles themselves. However, the major trend is there. So that's why they have their proposals and we have ours. I will say our proposal, China's proposal for the reform WTO, is not totally against the wills, wishes, and expectations of the United States. But however, they are not today try to go into the same river at the same time.
Right. Well, Mr. Zhou,
Yes.
you were instrumental in doing research
Yes.
about the WTO
Yeah.
and
Very
also
good.
provide the advice to the policymakers at the time when China was weighing the pros and cons of joining the World Trade Organization. And now China is at another critical stage, which is to play its appropriate role in the reform of the World Trade Organization. What can we draw the inspirations from the past history?
I, together with some professors, worked on that ever since China applied for the resumption of her membership in GATT as early as 1986. What we do, or what we did, the only thing is we tried to have a thorough analysis of the rules and laws and doctrines, together with cases of GATT and later WTO, to see what we can take. Meaning, we need to have reforms ourselves. We need to take the big changes ourselves as something as a must. So the encouragement today is we need to take lots of new trends in terms of practices and in terms of laws and rules later as something we need to do.
So how is that, for example, the U.S.-China trade negotiation, which is bilateral, but in a way be able to help China to streamline its own plan for further reform and opening up, and also have an impact about China's role within the reform process of WTO? That's an interesting question, isn't it, Mr. Zhou?
It's a very interesting question, because starting from May 2018 up to today, almost 9 months already, 7 rounds of negotiations have been finished, have been gone. What we can take from that, what the world is expecting. The world is expecting not only the good result of the negotiation between two countries, but try to see what kinds of new rules and doctrines, even the shape of the rules and doctrines could be worked out. So this is a due responsibilities. One, on one side, is for two countries. On the other side, it could have very strong impact for the future WTO reform. So we do have a sincere expectation that the negotiation could be very well finished. Not to see who is loser, who is winner. So far as negotiation is concerned, both are winners. I will say 3 things we need to remember first. So long the result is benefiting Chinese people to realize much better future in terms of our life and work, then we follow it. Second, so long this is a kind of reform we need to take in very different aspects, then we need to take it. And the third, so long this kind of negotiating could set up a very good example to solve disputes between the number 1 and number 2 in the world. Because you may have read a book by Professor Allison. His name is very, I will say, shocking. Meaning, can we escape? Can we avoid a war between the United States and China? Let's see. If this negotiation is successful, it will set up a very good example to see this is the way we need to solve between two not superpowers, number 1 and number 2 countries, then can set up another example for people to follow.
Now, this year, when the 2 sessions are going on, it's very clear China is facing quite some challenges. But at the same time, China is determined to overcome these challenges in order to get to the next stage. To you, what is the most important thing for now?
China is facing challenges all the time, but this year could be very critical, meaning bilaterally we are negotiating with the United States, not only for tariff issue, but for very comprehensive issues covered by the agreement. Second, China is facing WTO reform later on. So what we need to do, we need to take the courage from the past experience. The courage is, so long this is something in long term will benefit this nation and the people of this nation, we need to take it.
All right.
So sometimes, so-called prices we pay, that's in short term. In long term, if this nation could be so well respected by the world, then this is a victory.
Zhou Hanmin, a CPPCC Standing Committee member. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or find out our program on the YouTube, as well as Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.